So welcome everyone to our last of 3 lectures on the Underground Railroad, celebrating Fort Negley's inclusion on the National Park Service Underground Railroad Networked Freedom. The lectures are being presented by Metro Parks and Friends of Fort Negley Park, with sponsors, very generous sponsorships from Vanderbilt University, African American Historical and Genealogical Society, the Nashville chapter, Edge Hill Neighborhood Partnership, my alma mater, Lipscomb University, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I always like to say I paid full price for Lipscomb, so it's nice to get a little money back through sponsorships. Sharon Francis, South Nashville Action People, Sons of Union Veterans, Camp Number 62, and Trevecca Nazarene University, Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Saw Dr. Erica Hayden joining again tonight. Thanks, Dr. Hayden. All right, so tonight we have Dr. Lee Williams, a history professor of Tennessee State University. Dr. Williams' North Nashville History Project is, I think, just about made you a certified local. Is that right, Dr. Williams?
I guess. It's been 12 years now, so I guess local.
It's getting you there, right?
Yes, yeah.
All right. Dr. Williams serves on the Friends of Fort Negley Park Board, Metro Historic Zoning Commission Board, as well as the Historic Nashville Inc. Board. Any other that I missed on those boards? I know you're very active in preservation community.
Historic Zoning Commission and Historic Nashville. Right?
Perfect.
Well, anybody that's out there from Historic Nashville, thanks for joining.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us and using the free time that you do have with us tonight. And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen first. Okay, can y'all see that okay?
Dr. Williams, your slideshow has not popped up just yet.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Before we get started, let's pause for a second and have a moment of silence for our friends and family who have succumbed to COVID-19 and those who are still wrestling with it as we speak today. So let's pause for a moment and then we'll get started. Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And first I want to thank Fort Negley and Tracy for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this evening. And I want to thank you all for joining in. I do realize that it is, it's Friday Eve, and y'all could be doing a bunch of other stuff, but you're here to listen to me for a few minutes. And I'll do my best to make it worth your while. But what I want to do this evening is to talk a little bit, to share my thoughts about this city that we live in and look at it from the perspective of it being a gateway to freedom. I got several slides to show you, and I want this lecture to be a little bit different in that I want you to try to put yourself in the position of the people that I am talking about. Try to imagine that you are going through what I'm talking about this evening. And once we get to the end, I'll entertain any questions about your thoughts about the experiences, or if there was something unclear that you didn't catch, I'll address it at that time. So the title is I Ain't Got Long to Stay Here. And I came up with this title by coming to the conclusion that, escape from slavery for many of these people was a thought that they entertained as soon as they got here, as soon as they arrived here. I thought about runaways, and we'll look at that in this lecture. I thought very deeply about why they ran away and then where they were going to go once they left. But having said that, when African Americans arrived here in chains, they came to a place where the whites who brought them here saw a lot of opportunity. I mean, when James Robertson and John Donaldson and the others, when they pull up along the bluff on the Cumberland, they say, okay, this is a good place to settle. I can imagine those African Americans who would eventually make up about 25% of the population. I imagine them looking around and seeing the landscape as a place of horror, a place that terrorized them. And I'm saying this because they came from places that had well-established slave systems, right? The first Englishmen arrived in Jamestown in 1607, so they'd been planting tobacco in Jamestown right on. And then when North Carolina is established, these are well-developed societies by the time they make it here. So the land had been tamed where they left, and now they're coming here, and I can imagine them getting off the boat and seeing an abundance of hickories and cedars and hawthorns, and up to the north of what is Nashville, they would have saw some pine. And then as they disembarked, they would have saw river cane that stood perhaps about 8 to 10 feet high. So they're looking at this, and this is not a place of opportunity for them, not by a long shot. Moreover, for all of them that came here, even though they have a very close-knit bunch because they all have the same experience, everybody that they left back in Virginia and in North Carolina and the places that they were taken from, it was almost as if those folks had died. So as I ask you to imagine what it would have been like for them, consider this: everybody that they loved, all of the friends that they had, chances are that they weren't going to see those people anymore in that lifetime. But they are here, and they become an integral part of the community. As we look at this, I want y'all to pay attention to one of my favorite characters from the territorial period, and that is a guy named Jack Civil. We're not really sure if Jack Civil was a slave or whether he's a free Black person, but he comes to Fort Nashboro and he becomes involved in the society, and he does what he's supposed to do, right? He's a integral part of the society. He's there, he's working. But then when James Robertson begins to hand out land warrants, he calls out names, but Jack Civil's name is not called. So I'm not really sure how he responded to this, whether he was upset or whether he was indifferent to it, but I do know what happened in the short term. Jack Civil was a part of a flotilla that traveled down the river to what is now present day Donaldson. He was on the Stones River. And, you know, they're going there and they're going there to harvest the corn, and they do so. But then while they are leaving, they are attacked by a group of Cherokee. And the Cherokee all but massacre everybody but a few people in the party. Jack Civil was one of the survivors. But here's where it gets interesting. Jack Civil is either taken prisoner or he joins up with the Cherokee, who then take him down toward Chattanooga. And he becomes a part of their community, a very important part, so much so that they establish a small community that becomes known, that whites in Nashville knew as Nick Jack's place. And it's one of those things I remember when I first came to Tennessee, my first trip up here to try to find a place to stay. And, you know, I'm on 24, and right outside of Chattanooga, I see a sign that says Nickajack Lake and Reservoir. And I was looking at the sign, I was like, something doesn't quite look right about that sign. I don't know how I feel about that. Well, turns out that's what whites called that community. But then I later learned that Nickajack actually was a Native American word for falling waters. But Nickajack's place served as a location, as a headquarters from which Jack Civil launched raids against whites that settled in Middle Tennessee. And it got to the point to where the folks that were in Nashville they said, hey, we need to do something about Jack and his Native American comrades that are down there. So they come and they destroy the place, they destroy the community, but they don't get their hands on Jack. Later on, he returns to Nashville, right? He returns to Nashville. And he explains to the settlers that he wasn't involved in any of those attacks against whites. Matter of fact, he said in one of the early accounts, that he never raised his gun against any white settler. They didn't believe him, but they accepted him back in the society. And then he later goes on to marry a Native American woman. Now, I mentioned this because it's an excellent story. It's a cool story, right? But in many respects, Nickajack is one of the earliest examples that we have of African Americans being dissatisfied with their conditions, so much so that they move on to another place. They go to another place and they try to set up. So they saw where freedom lay outside of Nashville. Now, Jack did come back, but even though he returns, that's still consistent with a lot of enslaved people who ran away. Oftentimes they would run away and then they would return home. And we wrestle with why they would do that, but you got to realize that there's a lot of unknown out there. And when we talk about the Underground Railroad, you know, there were clues, there were messages, there were instructions that were given. But if things don't go your way, if things become too hectic, then it might be more beneficial to you to come home. But this particular scene right here is near Odom's Bend. As the river travels near Odom's Bend, from what I understand, one of the most notorious slave traders in American history, Isaac Franklin, disembarked his slaves near here. And what he did, he disembarked them here, he marched them to the Gallatin, and then from Gallatin, he took them into Nashville. Now, as you consider this, consider that, or imagine for a moment that you are one of these enslaved people that are coming to Nashville to be sold. You might be a mother with your children there, and you're not really sure whether or not the person that purchases you is going to purchase your children. So you don't know if this march is going to be the very last time that you'll spend with them. And we're mindful that it was a very difficult, a very arduous march. In an amazing poem that was written by Jesmond Ward, she talks about how during the slave march, the people's skin grew around the ropes. But you arrive in Nashville and you are being sold. There are a couple of things I want to point out. For most African Americans that arrived in Nashville during this time, they came here in chains. If they arrived in Nashville and if they weren't in a coffle or they didn't have chains on, they would be viewed as suspect. But they arrive in Nashville and they are sold either at the courthouse on the public square or amongst the many slave brokers that lined 4th Avenue North and what was then Charlotte. In my classes at TSU, we tried to imagine what it would have been like for an enslaved person to be sold at this corner. Because there's some spaces in the city, you can go to some places in the city that has a certain energy to them, like you go to a certain park and you feel kind of good about being at that park. But then by that same token, once we learn the history of certain spaces, these spots don't feel right. So we're at 4th and Charlotte, and I can remember being in class and asking the students what sort of emotions would they imagine they would be feeling if they were at this corner about to be sold. And my students are pretty sharp, y'all. Some said that fear would be an emotion. Some said that anger would be an emotion that they felt. Some argued that they would go a little bit beyond anger. They would be feeling rage. Then there was others that argued that they might have problems trusting anybody again. And then for the children that were sold there by themselves or separated from their families, there's a lot of confusion, and you can imagine them just facing a multitude of social and in some instances physical issues as a result of the sale in these spaces. So I'm saying all that to say this. For much of its history, Nashville was a destination that would lead to a very bleak future for you if you were an African American. But I've said that, but this is why I think this conversation is so important, because it pushes me to flesh out something that I said in class, that we might need to consider Nashville as a place where some African Americans came because they saw freedom. They thought that they might come here, and this place could either be a gateway to freedom or a place where they could find freedom of some sort. Now, it's an interesting statement to say, and historians, we can say whatever we want to say, but you got to have evidence. So where do we go for the evidence to support what some might consider a wild claim. The first thing I looked at were the slave patrols. Slave patrols were patrols that were organized to be blunt, to control the African-American community, to keep track of the Black community. And what it was a group of men, sometimes that numbered anywhere from 4 to 6, who patrolled the town from dusk to dawn. And what they were charged with doing was to essentially make sure that African Americans or enslaved African Americans and free Blacks were where they were supposed to be at a given time. That is, they were to ensure that they weren't in groups that were large enough to be deemed dangerous, but also they were given the authority to accost, to molest any Black person, free or slave, that they saw on the streets. So they could stop them, they could question them, and they also had the authority to administer corporal punishment. Now, if you go to the Nashville, to the Davidson County codes, you see where it's written into the code that they're going to have a slave patrol. And this begins, the very first evidence of this we see is in 1804. And we're mindful that that is less than a decade after this city has been established. Already they're establishing patrols to keep an eye on the enslaved population. So much so that it became a requirement for white males to participate in this. Now, bear in mind, if you served on the slave patrol, you were able to avoid other civic duties, like you wouldn't have to worry about jury duty or anything like that. But this is what you were charged with doing. So you could accost people on the street that you thought looked suspicious, but moreover, you could enter the dwelling of any enslaved person or free person that you chose to do in order to see if somebody was in there hiding or whatever. So now what I gather from this is that, runaway slaves were a problem very early on in Nashville's history. Freedom-seeking slaves, freedom-seeking African Americans were an issue very early on in the city's history. And the evidence is everywhere once you start looking. You can see it in the historical record, but also in some of the slave narratives. For example, this particular excerpt is from one of the slave narratives that are found on Jefferson Street, from an enslaved person that lived on Jefferson Street. He says, "I heard my mother speak about the patrols. I don't know whether they were patrols or not. They had guards out to see if the slaves had passes, and they would stop them when they would be going out for anything. They would stop my mother when she would be going out to get the cows to see if she had a pass." So tremendous authority were given to these individuals. And also, as we look during the early period, and you try to get some idea of where they are running away to, there are hints once we look at the fugitive slave ads from the period. Here's one that was placed by somebody that we all know very well living in Nashville, Andrew Jackson. I won't read all of this to you, but what he's doing is he's looking for an enslaved man that has run away named Austin. And I remember talking to a professor a long time ago when the ink was still very wet on my PhD. He said, "Lee, pay close attention to the fugitive slave ads because they are just pregnant with information about the institution and the individuals. So as you look at this, as you scroll through this, you see that Austin was he had an issue with his left eye. He was a good cook, a good washer, good house servant, a coachman, gardener, seamster, farmer, and can even read. And when you look at this guy he's an enslaved man, but in many respects, he's a Renaissance man because he's done a lot of stuff that I can't do as a person living in the 21st century. But having said that, when we look at him, we see that Jackson is desperate to get this guy back. But moreover, he says this, and this is the one thing that I pull from this that I really want y'all to consider, is that he says he will either make for Indian territory or the eastern part of Tennessee where he was raised. And when I see that, I understand that, hey, his family was probably somewhere in East Tennessee. But what does this statement mean about Indian territory? What it suggests to me that, when we think about the Underground Railroad and Dr. Landers did an excellent job of drawing our attention to this when she caused us to think about enslaved people running south, escaping to the south. I think we probably need to pay closer attention to enslaved African Americans who ran away to Native American groups who become absorbed in those populations. There's a lot of work been done on that in Florida, but I can only think of maybe one or two books and articles that addresses that here in Tennessee. So for the purpose of this lecture, bear in mind that when we talk about enslaved African Americans who are seeking freedom, many of them are trying to make it to the north, but bear in mind, some are just trying to make it to Indian territory. Or maybe there's others that are trying to make it to Nashville, and they figure that if they got a skill, they can blend in amongst the legion of hired out slaves that are living in this city. Now, escape. This, I think, is where the shift begins from looking at Nashville as a destination for enslavement to where we see it as a place where African Americans are seeking freedom. So let's see. The first one I want you to consider is just a runaway boy by the name of Joe. He's 22 years old. And he describes being smart, dressing well, and weighs about 140 pounds. Some unsoundness in his teeth. He's a painter, paper hanger, barber, tries to show off in conversation, and his pronunciation is somewhat peculiar. And this is a peculiar part of this ad. I think he is lurking about Nashville. So in the conversation about enslaved people running away, and we're thinking about them running to the north, to Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, or even to Canada, which was the ultimate destination for the Underground Railroad. If you are a skilled slave, if you're an enslaved person with a skill, I suspect it'd be pretty easy to come to this city and to pass yourself off as a hired out enslaved person. That is, you can pass yourself off as one of these quasi-independent enslaved people that Dr. Lovett talks about in his book on Black Nashville. Then there are others. These are peculiar or interesting in that when you look at these ads, these two women have two things in common, and that is they're both pregnant. The one woman is owned by Thomas Britton. And this one really draws your attention because if you look at the age here, it says what she's about 15 years old, common size, and now pregnant with child. And over here you have a Negro girl named Mary. She's about 5'4" or 5'5", has a scar on the side of her neck, which is very perceptible when notice is taken. She's Black, and she's also pregnant. Now, these women, you imagine, for those of you that have had children, after you get to a certain state, you're not going to be doing a whole bunch of walking, I don't suspect, or hiking, or in rural areas, just out there doing this and that. So when you see ads like this, and you think about them in the context of the Underground Railroad, it just enslaved people seeking freedom, you got to consider that these people have reached a point of desperation, a place where they've said that, hey, I'd rather be dead than give birth to a child and have them experience what I am going through. And another thing to consider is that Mr. Britton and Mr. Thompson would have been desperate to get these girls back. Why? Because as you all understand, the status of the child followed that of the mother during slavery. So if the mother was a slave, the child was going to be a slave. So when Britton looks at this 15-year-old who has run away with the baby, he's anxious to get her and that baby back. But more importantly, he's figuring that Sarah can, if she's 15, she can give birth to maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more kids by the time by the time she gets to the point to where she can't bear any children. So she's run away, and Mary has run away. And these pregnant women not only represent a loss of a current profit, but future profit as well. And this is one of my favorite stories about Nashville. Many of y'all are familiar with the story of Henry Box Brown. For those of you that don't know, Henry Box Brown was an enslaved man who had a white friend build him a box, and he got inside and he mailed himself to freedom. He mailed himself to the office of a guy named William Still. This is one of the more interesting stories that I can remember from grad school. But lo and behold, we find that you have a similar story here in Nashville, where a guy literally tries to ship himself to freedom. He's not as successful as Brown, however. This guy gets caught in Antioch, and the gentleman that was assisted him ended up committing suicide, and the other gentleman was brought home back into slavery. But what this reveals or suggests to us as students and scholars of history is that slavery cultivated oftentimes a desperation for freedom amongst the enslaved, a desire for freedom that I would argue is still unmatched in our history. And then there are more desperate efforts to obtain freedom. In this particular episode, you have a Negro girl belonging to Elsie Lisby. And it describes her hanging herself last week. She hung herself because her mother had escaped. And the authorities began pressuring her to divulge where her mother had gone. So instead of giving information about her mother, she committed suicide. And this is another story that, and I promise you the stories will get a little bit better. We'll stop talking about suicide in a minute. But this particular woman belonged to Dempsey Weaver. And this text is pretty blurry, so I'll explain what happened. This particular woman got with her husband and they planned to escape. And according to the text, she was supposed to meet him by the river after dark. And she's there with her two children, and I can imagine her waiting for her husband, but he doesn't show. Then finally, in one last act of desperation, she puts the child under each arm and jumps into the river, and all three drown. This story is reminiscent of, for those of y'all that have read Toni Morrison's masterpiece, Beloved, y'all will remember a scene in there where Setha is explaining what she did to her kid, why she killed one of her babies. And she said this, she said she put her baby where they would be safe. As you contemplate that and try to square that with what you're reading here, this gives you some insight into the institution. Why? Because I think one of the most powerful manifestations of love that I can think of is the love that a mother has for her children. But in this instance, when escape seemed impossible, she chose death. And then there's Esther. Esther, she's enslaved, but she's a woman that is very confident, so much so she's becoming a bit of a concern to her master. And there's a quote here that jumps right out, jumps off the page at me. She says, she began behaving herself very badly around January 1854. She had fallen into the habit of sexual intercourse and was injuring her health by such habits. In fact, she formed a criminal intimacy with and was living with a white man in the city as his mistress. Well, this guy figured that she was unmanageable and in danger of running away, so he decided to sell her, and he was looking for $1,000 for her. So when we look at this, consider this, Nashville was a point that led to slavery, but by that same token, you have some who utilized this city to live as free as they possibly could. Now, as far as running away, let's say, for example, we embrace the idea that they're going to run away to maybe Ohio or Canada or just to the north. For a person who was traveling by foot, it would be a pretty difficult journey. Now, I ask you to imagine what the geography of Nashville looks like to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. So imagine you're going to Franklin, for example, or you're heading out toward Cookeville, or you're heading toward Memphis, or you're heading toward Clarksville. What would it be like for an enslaved person who's trying to run away, who's running at night? It's difficult enough to negotiate the terrain during the daytime, but imagine doing so at night. Okay, so you leave Nashville and you're heading east. This photograph of Cummings Falls. I remember walking down there one summer to check out the falls and feeling like they were going to have to lifelike me out of there, because for those of y'all that have never visited, you know, your cars are way up here and you're down there. So as I'm down there, I'm thinking, I'm like, wow, somebody had to negotiate this area. Then once you get beyond that, you got all those branches of the Caney Fork River, right, that you have to cross. If you travel to the west, you have the area around the Harpeth Narrow. So it's very rocky, very rugged terrain. So if I'm an enslaved person, I'm trying to travel there by foot, it would be difficult. Even more so if I'm trying to travel as a group, or I'm trying to travel as a family, or if I'm traveling with children, or Lord help me if I'm traveling and I'm pregnant. I oftentimes look at the rivers that surround the city in interesting ways. And I remember day before yesterday, Dr. Landers gave some insight into how enslaved people traveled from South Carolina to Formosa. And it made me think about these rivers, not so much as geographical boundaries, but as roads, as avenues that would take you to freedom or to other destinations. This is a shot of the Cumberland, and it made me think about this quote by a great American poet, Amiri Baraka, where he talks about this. He says, at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, there's a railroad made of human bones. And I began to think about the Cumberland being that sort of space as well. There's one episode during the 1850s where an enslaved man was discovered aboard a steamer. When he tried to lay hands on him, he grappled with one of the men and tried to jump off the boat with him into the Cumberland. When he failed to do that, he jumped into the Cumberland and didn't resurface. He drowned there. So for him, the Cumberland provided freedom. But let's say we wanted to use the Cumberland to make our way to freedom. What would that look like? I'm a curious guy, and if you can tell if I like you, I'm gonna ask you a lot of questions. So I hung out with a gentleman who recently negotiated he recreated the journey that James Robertson had in coming to Nashville. So I'm hearing about this, and I wanted, and I guess he thought I would ask him about, what it was like for the Donaldson party. And my first question was, I'm like, hey, if I was an enslaved man here in Nashville and I get on a boat and I'm trying to make it to the Ohio River, how many days would I had to hide out? And he said, depending upon the flow of the river, but he said anywhere from 4 to 7 days. So I'm saying all that to say this. If you're actually trying to get to the north, Nashville is an opportune place to come, because you could board a ship here, board a boat here, and then ultimately you would try to make it to Smithland, Kentucky. And once you arrive there, you're at the Ohio River. And the only thing you would have to do now after making that long journey is to make it across the river and then up, and you would be free. But here's the thing, you might imagine that there are a ton of slave catchers hanging out in Smithland who are thinking that, hey, okay, we're going to look for some suspicious looking Black people and just assume that they are fugitives. So even the effort of being free, of trying to obtain your freedom, wouldn't really be obtainable until you were deep in the North. But even with that, after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, slavery freedom wasn't guaranteed for you if you made it to the North. This is a scene from Lake Erie. So if you imagine yourself making it to Ohio, and then you've traveled all the way across the state, and now you're at Lake Erie, and this photograph is near a town called Sandusky. You're looking over the river and you're waiting for the sun to go down, and knowing that once the sun goes down, you're going to get in the boat and make it over to Canada. Oftentimes think about the emotions at the time. Perhaps the apprehension, the joy, the nervousness, just an abundance of emotions. And as I thought about this, there's a line from a Lucille Clifton poem that resonated with me. And it says this: every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. So in my mind, for the enslaved people who are at the doorstep of freedom, although this might not be what they didn't articulate it this well, but I'm sure this is what they felt. Okay. I got a whole lot to say about Fort Negley, but I'm looking at the clock and I'm up against it. So I'll pull up and take any questions you may have. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I mentioned in the chat, I wrote in the chat box earlier, if you have any questions for Dr. Williams, you're welcome to go ahead and enter those into the chat box that's at the bottom center part of your screen. If you put your cursor down there, it should highlight. While we're waiting on anybody to enter a question, I'm going to just note if you had not seen in the email for this week, reminding you of the lectures, we also received from the National Park Service a Junior Ranger activity book. So coming up, if you want to bring your kids out, bring your grandkids out, bring yourself out, there is a wonderful Junior Ranger activity book through the National Park Service. There's about 20 pages worth of activities, so certainly more than just a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And they can even, once complete, send off for a Junior Ranger badge. That's through the National Park Service. So we've got one question pulled up from Evelyn. She's asking about how many enslaved people were in Nashville or the Nashville area.
Okay, depends upon the year. I want to say by the Civil War, you're looking at perhaps want to say about 14,000 at the end of the Civil War. The number may be off a little bit, but that's the number that jumped into my head. I'm sorry, I can't be more precise.
If I remember correctly, pre-African Americans living in Nashville is what, around 2,500, 2,000, 2,500?
It wasn't, let's say this, the enslaved population far outnumbered the free Black population. And I'm sorry I can't be more precise, Ms. Long, on that.
Well, I have one that popped up while you're presenting is with a community that size, free African American or even semi-independent slave people that are working in Nashville. Do we know whether that community is concentrated into one area, like we would see kind of what pops up around Fort Negley and other forts during the war, or were they most likely scattered?
More than, oh, I'm sorry, let me let you finish the question.
That's just that, whether or not they were concentrated in one area or most likely scattered across the city.
According to my understanding of it, many of them lived around what is now Charlotte Avenue, some downtown. A little bit later, you have a community that develops, it's called Black Bottom. And it's actually called that because of the mud that's left after the flooding. But downtown, you'd have quite a few enslaved people that were hired out. John Overton had a mule skinner that he hired out and he'd send to town from time to time. But urban slavery was a bit different in that it afforded enslaved Blacks some freedom that they might not have on the farm. But nonetheless, they were still very much surveilled. So it's a freedom, but it's a really precarious freedom. And you got to bear in mind too that you had slave catchers who would oftentimes lay hands on a free person and take them down further south. So if they take them to southern Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana, where nobody knows them, you can't prove that you were a free person. And thank you for the question.
One thing that popped up, I've already forgotten the woman's name, the one caught living as the mistress to a man in 1854, I believe it was. So what, perhaps just a theory, or what struck me is, they're being sold or offered at $1,000 seems like still a very high price.
It is, and
for someone that is seems to be causing a lot of trouble for you. And I wondered if in that all that very formal language and nice language was actually an ad for something selling more than just someone that's giving you a lot of trouble.
I suspect she was a fancy girl. Fancy girls were typically enslaved women of mixed parentage who were sold essentially to be, concubines. So oftentimes they would be put up in apartments or homes, and they would live typically very well because they were some of the most expensive of all of the people that were enslaved. But they did prove to be kind of problematic because they lived better than some white women. Their children, by extension, also would be dressed better, would look better. So she's a slave, but she doesn't appear to be a slave, not only in how she looks, but also how she behaves.
Thank you for that. We do have another question. How did slavery in Nashville compare to other urban areas in the South?
Nashville is in a state that's classified as the urban, the upper South. So you don't find it, and the population of Black folks that are living here as well is not as large as, say, in other places. So when I look at Nashville, I see a lot of enslaved people that are hired out. I see a free Black population that, they are occupying a position where, they're not slaves, but in many instances, some of them are as poor as slaves. On one hand, you might have some that try to identify very closely to whites, but they realize that they're never going to be fully integrated into that world. So on one hand, you might have a barber whose clientele is all white people, and he's making good money. But having said that, he'd never be accepted as equal. One of the best bakers in this city was a lady named Sarah Estelle. She also made ice cream. She was an excellent caterer, but nonetheless, she's still not equal.
I'll pull up one of our attendees, Bill Howell, pulled from Dr. Levitt's book, page 6, 1860. Free Black population is 719.
Okay.
3,226 enslaved, and that's out of a total population in Nashville just under 17,000.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that, Bill.
And, Eleanor Fleming just had a comment. Thanking you for the rich presentation. Curious about your thoughts on what freedom was like in Nashville. Do we have good primary sources and first-person data of these people?
I would look at J.C. Napier's book because he talks about it. You can also, if you go back to the Nashville Globe, roughly around the turn of the century, you'll find excerpts from Nashvillians that emerged out of that period. There are ministers who talk about perhaps their mothers being enslaved. I know J.C. Napier, there's a really good article that he's interviewed in, I think it was around the 1920s, where he goes out and he talks about the precise location of all of the slave markets around town. And then the slave narratives themselves, which, they're good sources, but you also got to take them with a grain of salt because you have to take into account the fact that this Black person being interviewed by a white person during the 1930s, and then they are older. And none of our memories get better over time. And if they're being interviewed in the 30s, chances are they were children during slavery. So you have to take all of that into account. There's still a lot of good information there. If you're interested in pursuing that further, look at the Tennessee narratives, but also the Oklahoma narratives as well. There's a lot of good stuff on Nashville in the Oklahoma narratives. Okay, thank you for the question.
Got one more that's popped up from Evelyn. When slavery was abolished, did Nashville accept fast, or was there adjustment time?
It was an adjustment time. Because, and this is part of the Fort Negley narrative, because you have an influx of African Americans who come here and they reside in contraband camps throughout the war. And once the war ends, a lot of them stay here. And then you got to take in account too that the war ends in Lee surrenders in April 1865. On Christmas Eve that same year, the Klan is born in Giles County. And Fort Negley figures in that story as well, because they had Klan initiations at the summit of St. Cloud Hill. Nathan Bedford Forrest is elected the Grand Wizard of the Klan in a Nashville hotel. I'm saying that to say this. When we look at Nashville and try to determine whether they accepted abolition, you have to be a bit more precise in our definition of what Nashville is. There's one part of Nashville that were unrepentant Confederates. They were never going to accept it. But then you have, you have others who are in government whom I believe make sincere efforts. So saying all that, it was very difficult to nail down what freedom meant, because it didn't mean the same thing for everybody. The key point in all of this, and I'll stop beating on this question in a second. When these African Americans arrive in Nashville, they don't come here empty-handed. They bring their culture with them. So whether or not the entire city embraced abolition, they were informed by the beliefs and attitudes of the people that come here. Because we identify ourselves as the music city, right? You can't call Nashville the music city without taking into account the songs that these folks that escaped to Nashville raised up out of the cotton fields and the tobacco fields and so forth. We pride ourselves on being the Athens of the South, where we were lying to the world actually until African Americans come here, and they are very much pushing for education. But not only that, there's the idea that the state should be responsible for educating its citizens. That's an idea that comes with them. Okay. And thank you for the question.
All right. Looks like we've got one last question from Jennifer. Were there any safe houses in Nashville that enslaved people could hide from their owners or fellow white people who helped the African American community?
I don't know, and it's not for lack of looking. I've heard about a church, but I'm not going to put it on blast because I'm not convinced that that they were. I don't know if my friend Joel Dark is in the audience. Talk to him and he can give you some information on that. But I don't know, and the fact that I don't know speaks to how effective they were, because it was common knowledge then it wouldn't be safe houses, I guess. Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Lone, for the question.
All right, I believe those are everyone's questions. Of course, if anything pops up, say something strikes you later on, you can certainly email us at fortnegley@nashville.gov, and we'll certainly try and get you an answer. We'll connect with Dr. Williams if we need to, and see if we can get more information. Dr. Williams, I do want to thank you again for coming out and presenting tonight. Enjoyed that presentation. A lot of good interaction with our attendees. We'll go ahead and close. I'll recognize our sponsors again. Our sustaining sponsor, Vanderbilt University, as well as African American Historical and Genealogical Society, Nashville chapter. If you have not connected with them and you are doing genealogical work, they are a major resource, well worth getting connected to if you're trying to do family genealogy. Edgehill Neighborhood Partnership with the University College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Ms. Sharon Francis. South Nashville Action People. So it is nice to have those two community groups that are on both sides of Fort Negley, Edgehill, and South Nashville Action People. Sons of Union Veterans Camp number 62, and Rebecca Nazarene University Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Thank you to all those sponsors who helped make this possible.